For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Let me first thank the gentleman from Missouri, the author of the legislation, for his good work on this. We do desperately need to modernize the Bank Secrecy Act and the way in which law enforcement evaluates potential financial crimes in this country. It's a long time coming, and there's a lot of good language that the gentleman has included in this legislation, legislation that's been built on work in the last Congress as well. And in particular, I would like to note the language, which I don't think has been discussed here in the debate today or the discussion here today, the provisions that enhance Treasury attaches. If the gentleman from Missouri would just, I want to applaud you, Mr. Cleaver, for including the language regarding amplifying the Department of Treasury's role in our embassies around the world. In my travels to embassies in difficult parts of the world, one of the recommendations from many of our foreign service personnel is that we do need more Treasury attaches in order to combat terrorism, to combat illicit finance. This is a very important provision that's included in your bill, and I applaud you for including that in there. And I look forward to seeing this legislation assist both the Department of Treasury and our State Department in combating terrorism and illicit finance around the world. I also would commend the gentleman, the author of the bill, for including language in here to enhance the sharing of SAR information with regulated financial institutions and authorizing those reports and feedback loops. One of the constant complaints that I get from regulated financial institutions in Kentucky is that for all the work that they go through to comply with the BSA and the AML rules, they don't get any kind of feedback from FinCEN to tell them that number one, they're filing these reports properly or not, but also, is the information that they're supplying to law enforcement actually catching the bad guys? And I think these feedback loops will be a very positive addition to the BSA regime. So overall, I'm supportive of the legislation. I also appreciate my friend from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for all of his work on this. I think with his negotiations with Mr. Cleaver, we've got a better product. The studies to improve the reporting, the indexing of the CTR threshold is a positive step in the right direction. I think all of this will make the BSA regime more efficient and effective for law enforcement, regulatory authorities, and financial institutions. Final point is related to the actual reports, the CTR reports, and the thresholds. One of the piece of feedback from the banking regulators in Kentucky is that the CTR form needs to be shortened. And so when the GAO is doing this study, to the extent the GAO or the Secretary of the Treasury or FinCEN actually pays attention to congressional intent here, I hope they pay attention to this. The CTR form needs to be shortened. And it needs to be shortened because it needs to have only the salient information collected during the reporting process. The information that's collected through the CTR appears often to not be accessed, used, or analyzed by law enforcement agencies, so the form itself needs to be reviewed. And then finally, on the Loudermilk amendment that was not fully adopted, I agree that we need an increase in the threshold. And if there's one criticism I have of the bill as amended, it would be that we need to increase the threshold. Filing these CTRs is a major burden for community banks. A recent study showed that large banks spend roughly 0.08% of their assets on BSA AML compliance because these banks have large, sophisticated compliance departments. But smaller institutions typically spend 10 times more on BSA AML compliance as a percent of their total assets. A small community bank or credit union may have one BSA AML compliance officer or just one compliance officer for the entire institution. The smaller the institution, the bigger the burden, as Mr. Loudermilk pointed out. And my bankers back home in Kentucky consistently tell me that SARs are one of their most burdensome regulations. So I guess my disappointment in the amendment is that we didn't take this opportunity to raise these thresholds consistent with inflation. And in conclusion, let me just make this point. Raising the thresholds would be good for law enforcement as well. Sometimes to find a needle in a haystack, you have to reduce the haystack. And we're not taking the opportunity here today to reduce the haystack, to help not just the banks, but to help law enforcement, and I hope in the future we'll take a look at that. I yield back.